I can generate the story, but I can't provide it in a separate document. However, I can write it here, and you can easily copy it into your own document. Here's part 1 of the story. At the grand mansion of a billionaire entrepreneur, the atmosphere was lively and filled with laughter. It was a celebration, a gala, where the richest and most influential people from around the world had gathered for an evening of luxury. The mansion was adorned with opulent decorations, and the guests were dressed in elegant attire, exchanging pleasantries over champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The billionaire, a man known for his sharp wit and love of attention, was at the center of the event, soaking in the adoration of his peers. He was in his late 40s, charismatic, and always the life of any party. He had built his empire from the ground up, and his wealth was unrivaled. His laugh echoed through the ballroom as he told stories of his latest business ventures, all of which captivated his audience. But tonight, something unusual happened that would change the course of the evening. In the corner of the room, a janitor wearing a faded uniform and rubber gloves quietly swept the floor. He had been working at the mansion for the past few weeks, taking care of the small details that most of the guests paid no attention to. His job was simple. He cleaned, swept, and made sure everything was in order for the guests to enjoy their lavish evening. He didn't belong to the world of glitz and glamour. He was just doing his job, unnoticed and unimportant to the crowd. The billionaire, whose attention often drifted between conversations, spotted the janitor. A mischievous grin spread across his face. He had always enjoyed pushing boundaries and making jokes at the expense of others. This time his eyes fell on the grand piano placed elegantly at one end of the room. The piano, with its polished surface and pristine keys, was the perfect target for his wit. With a voice loud enough for the whole room to hear, the billionaire addressed the crowd. "Play the piano and I'll marry you," he said, his words dripping with playful sarcasm. The guests, who had been mingling and enjoying the atmosphere, paused and turned their attention to him. Some laughed, others raised their eyebrows, wondering what he meant by the taunt. The janitor, who had been quietly working in the background, looked up for a moment. He had heard the billionaire's challenge, but he didn't respond. He didn't feel embarrassed or upset. He was simply doing his job, and he had heard jokes like this before. He returned to his task, sweeping the floor as if nothing had happened. The billionaire's comment had sparked more laughter from the guests. The challenge, although light-hearted, seemed to suggest that the janitor had no chance of fulfilling such a request. After all, he was just a janitor. Who would expect someone like him to possess any special skills, let alone the ability to play the grand piano that stood before him? "Go on, give it a try," someone in the crowd called out, egging the janitor on. The comments became more encouraging, though it was clear they were meant to mock rather than support. The janitor, still silent, stood there for a moment, his mop in one hand and the broom in the other. He glanced at the piano again, then back at the crowd. There was no hesitation in his eyes, just calm acceptance. The jokes, the laughter, the taunts, they didn't bother him, but something inside him stirred, and he felt an urge to respond in a way that no one would expect. Slowly, he placed the mop and broom aside. He wiped his hands on his uniform and walked over to the piano. The crowd watched him curiously, still unaware of what was about to unfold. He reached the piano and sat down. The guests, still laughing and chatting amongst themselves, didn't immediately notice the gravity of the situation. They assumed it was all part of the joke. After all, what could a janitor possibly know about playing such a beautiful instrument? The janitor's hands hovered over the keys for a moment. Then, with a deep breath, he began to play. At first, the music was soft and tentative, like a whisper in the room. The guests, who had been chatting amongst themselves, began to turn their attention toward the sound. It was a gentle melody, something familiar but unexpected. It was clear that the janitor knew what he was doing, but the crowd was still unsure of how to react. They had been expecting a disaster, not a performance, but as the notes flowed, the music became more confident. The janitor's fingers moved effortlessly across the keys, his touch smooth and precise. His body relaxed into the rhythm, and soon the entire room was drawn into the melody. The sound of the piano, once soft and tentative, now filled the room with a sense of depth and emotion. The guests, who had been laughing only moments ago, fell silent. The music was beautiful, hauntingly beautiful. It wasn't just a song, it was a story told through each note. The guests stood in stunned silence, some with their mouths slightly agape. It was as though they were hearing something they had never expected, something they could never have imagined. As the janitor continued to play, his concentration deepened. His fingers danced across the keys with an ease that belied his humble appearance. It became clear that this man, who had spent the evening unnoticed and dismissed, was not just any janitor. He was a master of the piano. The billionaire who had made the original taunt was now standing at the edge of the crowd, his expression frozen. The laughter in his eyes had disappeared, replaced with an expression of awe. He had expected to mock the janitor, but what he had underestimated was the janitor's skill. The crowd, too, began to realize the gravity of the situation. What they had thought was a joke was now an extraordinary performance. The janitor, who had been an invisible figure in the background, was now the center of attention for an entirely different reason. His music was no longer just a response to the challenge, it was a revelation. His performance was captivating, and the audience could do nothing but listen in awe. As the last notes of the song echoed through the room, the janitor slowly lifted his hands from the keys. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. No one spoke. No one moved. The janitor stood up, his face calm as if he had just done something as simple as sweeping the floor. He nodded slightly and turned to walk away. But before he could leave, the billionaire, still speechless, stepped forward. His previous taunt now seemed like a distant memory. "Wait," the billionaire said, his voice barely above a whisper. That was incredible. And in that moment, the entire room seemed to come to the same realization. The man they had dismissed, the janitor they had mocked, had just given them a performance they would never forget. This is quite the part one paros of the story, setting the stage for the surprising revelation and the shift in perception. Let me know if you'd like me to continue or make any adjustments. I can't provide the content in a separate document, but I can continue writing our part two round of the story here for you to copy and use. Here it is. The room, once filled with chatter and laughter, now stood in complete silence. The last notes of the piano lingered in the air, fading slowly into nothingness. The guests were still processing what they had just witnessed. Their eyes were wide, their mouths slightly agape, unable to comprehend how the humble janitor, who had been nothing more than a backdrop to their lavish evening, had just played the piano in a way that left them speechless. The billionaire stood motionless, as if frozen in place. He had come into the evening expecting to entertain himself at the expense of others, to make a joke at the expense of the man he had thought was beneath him. But now, standing at the edge of the room, his initial arrogance was replaced by awe. The janitor had not only proven him wrong, but he had also delivered a performance that no one in the room could have anticipated. The guests, who had been ready to mock and ridicule, now found themselves caught in the same feeling: admiration. They looked at each other, exchanging glances, unsure of what to say or how to react. The atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically, from one of light-hearted amusement to deep respect and wonder. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if time had stopped, as if everyone was waiting for something, anything, to happen next. Then, slowly, the billionaire approached the piano, his steps tentative at first. He was still processing the shock of the moment, trying to grasp how such a thing could happen. The janitor, meanwhile, stood quietly by the side of the room, watching the crowd's reaction. His expression was calm, even serene, as if he had expected nothing less than this response. He had not played for applause, nor had he played to prove anyone wrong. He had played because it was in him to do so. A talent, a gift, that had long remained hidden. As the billionaire reached the piano, he hesitated for a moment before speaking. "That was extraordinary," he said, his voice shaky. "I never would have imagined." He trailed off, struggling to find the words that would match the magnitude of the situation. "Where did you learn to play like that?" The janitor, who had been standing silently, looked up at him. His face was still composed, but there was a glint in his eyes, a quiet confidence that came from knowing the power of his own ability. He glanced around the room at the guests who had once mocked him, now staring at him in awe. But instead of basking in their admiration, he simply nodded. "I learned from my mother," he replied softly. "She taught me when I was young. Music was always part of our lives." The billionaire, still in shock, nodded slowly. He had no idea what to say. The crowd, which had once been so sure of their assumptions, now felt a sense of humility wash over them. They had judged the janitor based on his appearance and his role in the house, never imagining for a second that he was capable of something so extraordinary. "How did you end up here?" the billionaire asked, genuinely curious. He was no longer taunting the janitor. Now his voice was full of respect and admiration. The other guests, too, were listening intently, eager to hear the janitor's story. The janitor hesitated for a moment before answering. His past was not something he often shared with others. It was a simple life, one filled with struggles and challenges, but it had shaped him into the person he was today. "I've had my share of struggles," he said, his voice steady. "I was raised in a small town, not much more than a few houses and fields. My family didn't have much, but we had music. My mother always said that music was a gift, something that could carry us through tough times." He paused, his eyes distant as if recalling the memories of his youth. "When I was young, I would play on an old piano that my mother had saved up for. It was nothing fancy, but it was enough for me to learn. I never had formal lessons, but I played every chance I got. My mother encouraged me to play, even when things were hard." The guests, who had been standing in stunned silence, now looked at each other with a sense of realization. They had seen this man as just another worker in the background, but now they saw him as someone with a story, a history, a person with untapped potential. The janitor's words struck a chord with them, and for the first time that evening they began to see him as more than just a servant to their luxury. The billionaire, moved by the janitor's words, took a step back from the piano. "I had no idea," he said quietly. "You should never have been underestimated." His voice was filled with sincerity, and there was a palpable shift in the way he regarded the man before him. The janitor nodded, but he didn't respond. There was no need for further words. He had said enough. For a moment the room remained quiet. The guests, who had once been so eager to enjoy their own frivolity, now stood in reflection. Some seemed almost embarrassed by their earlier mockery. They realized how wrong they had been to make assumptions about a person based solely on their appearance or their role. The billionaire, however, broke the silence once again, his voice now calm and full of genuine admiration. "Would you play something else?" he asked, his tone humble. The janitor looked at him, surprised. He hadn't expected such a request. He wasn't used to being asked to perform for anyone, let alone for a room full of strangers who had only moments ago mocked him. But something in the billionaire's voice made him pause. There was no more jest in the air, only respect. After a brief moment of hesitation, the janitor sat back down at the piano. He placed his fingers gently on the keys, and without a word, he began to play once more. The music that filled the room this time was different. It was deeper, more personal. It wasn't just a performance anymore. It was an expression of who he was, of where he had come from, and of what he had overcome. As the notes echoed through the mansion, the guests stood still, their eyes fixed on the man at the piano. They were no longer thinking about his uniform, his position in the house, or his humble background. All they could hear was the beauty of the music, the incredible talent that had been hidden beneath the surface all along. For the first time that evening, the guests felt a shift. They were no longer in the presence of a janitor, but in the presence of a musician, a person whose skill and artistry transcended their previous assumptions. The billionaire, standing at the back of the room, looked on with a sense of awe. He had challenged the janitor, thinking it would be a harmless joke, but what he had received in return was something far more powerful. The janitor's music had stunned him, and in that moment he understood something deeper. Never judge a person by their outward appearance or their station in life. The guests, too, were beginning to understand the lesson. What they had seen as a joke was now a moment of clarity, a moment of realization that true talent could come from the most unexpected places. This is part 2 of the story. Let me know if you'd like to continue or make any adjustments. I can't provide the content in a separate document, but here's part 3 of the story in simple and engaging words. As the final notes of the janitor's impromptu performance echoed through the room, there was a stillness that hung in the air. The once bustling mansion, full of extravagant conversations and laughter, had transformed into a place of quiet contemplation. The guests, who moments before had been so focused on their wealth and status, now stood silently, their attention entirely on the man at the piano. Even the billionaire who had instigated this whole situation was now standing at the back of the room, unable to look away from the humble janitor who had just stunned them all. The janitor's fingers hovered above the piano keys for a moment, as if he were considering whether to play again. But before he could make up his mind, one of the guests, a woman dressed in an extravagant gown, spoke up. Her voice was soft but filled with wonder. "That was incredible," she said, her eyes still wide with amazement. "I never expected. I mean, we all thought, well, you know." She trailed off, her words faltering under the weight of the realization. She had been one of the many who had laughed at the janitor's request to play the piano, thinking it a joke or a fool's errand. But now, standing there, it was clear to her and everyone else in the room that they had all been wrong. The janitor simply nodded, his expression neutral. He wasn't one to seek attention or praise. His entire life had been spent in the shadows, working diligently behind the scenes, never asking for acknowledgement. Music was something he did because it brought him peace, not because he sought fame or recognition. But the response from the crowd, the shift in their energy, was something he hadn't anticipated. The billionaire, still standing at the back of the room, finally found his voice. "I owe you an apology," he said, his tone sincere. "I mocked you and I misjudged you. I thought you were just I thought you were just a janitor, but now I see that I was wrong." The other guests, who had been slowly absorbing the scene, now nodded in agreement. Some of them, who had initially joined in with the billionaire's jest, now felt a deep sense of embarrassment. They had laughed at the janitor's request to play, assuming he was out of place among the elite guests of the party. They had thought of him as nothing more than a worker, someone whose talent couldn't possibly compare to theirs. But the music he had just played had shattered that illusion. It had revealed a person they had all overlooked, a person with talent, passion, and a story to tell. "Thank you," the janitor replied quietly, his voice steady but humble. "But I don't seek anyone's apology. Music is just something I do. It's been with me since I was a child." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the guests. "I never asked to be treated differently. I simply wanted to share a part of myself with you." The billionaire, still processing the impact of the janitor's words, stepped forward. "That was beautiful," he said, his voice soft and sincere. "You've shown me something today that I didn't know I needed to see." At that moment, there was a shift in the atmosphere of the party. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and the guests, who had once been so consumed by their wealth and status, were now realizing the true value of something much deeper. Talent, passion, and humanity were not things that could be bought or owned. They were not defined by the position someone held in society. Instead, they came from within, from the heart. The billionaire looked at the janitor, his eyes filled with respect. "I've spent my entire life building wealth, surrounding myself with people who think just like me, who want the same things I want. But now, I see that there is more to life than just wealth. There's beauty in simplicity, in honesty, in the pure expression of something like music." The janitor gave a small smile, but he didn't say anything. He wasn't one for long speeches or grand gestures. He had lived his life in a way that was simple and to the point. He had done his work, played his music when he could, and kept to himself. But now, standing here in front of a room full of people who had once ridiculed him, he realized something profound. The value of a person was not determined by their job or their appearance. It was found in what they had to offer, their talents, their kindness, and the way they treated others. As the music hung in the air, there was a moment of silence. The guests began to turn to one another, murmuring quietly, reflecting on their own actions. For the first time in what felt like ages, they were no longer concerned with their wealth, their status, or their social circles. They were simply human beings acknowledging the presence of someone who had touched their hearts. The billionaire, still standing by the piano, glanced over at the janitor again. "You've taught us all a valuable lesson today," he said. "I'll never forget this moment." The janitor nodded, but his eyes were focused on the piano keys. He hadn't played for praise, he hadn't played for recognition, and he certainly hadn't played to make a statement. He had simply played because music was in him, and it had always been a way for him to connect with the world around him. It was the one thing in his life that had remained constant, no matter what his circumstances were. For the guests in the room, however, this moment would stay with them forever. They would remember the quiet janitor who had stepped forward to share his gift with them, and in doing so, had shown them the true meaning of talent and humility. The atmosphere in the room slowly began to shift once more. The tension had melted away, replaced by an unspoken understanding among the guests. Some of them were now looking at one another with a sense of guilt, while others were nodding, as if they had just realized something that had been right in front of them all along. The billionaire turned to face the crowd. "I think it's time we all take a moment to reflect on what just happened here," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "We've all been caught up in our own world of luxury and extravagance, but today we've witnessed something far more meaningful. A man, a janitor, showed us that true wealth doesn't lie in possessions. It lies in the heart, in the ability to share something beautiful with the world." The guests, now more subdued, nodded in agreement. The laughter and chatter that had filled the room before had been replaced by quiet conversation, as everyone seemed to be reflecting on the janitor's words and the music that had touched them so deeply. As the night wore on, the billionaire and the guests spent the rest of the evening in a much more thoughtful mood. There was no longer any talk of grand gestures or displays of wealth. Instead, they shared stories, exchanged ideas, and began to see one another in a new light. And as for the janitor, he simply returned to his quiet place in the background. He had never sought to be the center of attention, and he didn't need the applause or admiration. All he had wanted to do was play, to share his passion with others. And in doing so, he had changed their lives forever. This is part 3 and end of the story. Let me know if you'd like to continue or make any adjustments. Here's Kakure, part 4 of the story. The evening began to wind down, but the atmosphere remained charged with a quiet energy. What had started as an ordinary gathering of the city's elite had transformed into something deeper, something more meaningful. Guests who had once been lost in their own bubbles of wealth and status were now scattered throughout the room in small groups, reflecting on the performance they had witnessed. The loud chatter and clinking glasses that once filled the mansion had been replaced by hushed conversations and quiet exchanges. The music the janitor had played seemed to resonate long after the final note faded. The billionaire, who had been standing near the piano, continued to watch the janitor with a newfound respect. He had made the arrogant joke earlier, taunting the janitor with a ridiculous challenge, but now he found himself speechless. What had he expected when he'd made the bet? Certainly not this. A simple man who had quietly shocked them all with the beauty of his music. The billionaire felt a pang of guilt. He had underestimated the janitor, not only because of his status as a worker in the mansion, but because of his own arrogance and ignorance. He had assumed that someone in such a position, with no fancy clothes or prestigious job title, could not possess the kind of talent that the janitor had just displayed. But the performance had proved him wrong. In fact, it had shown him the limits of his own understanding. Talent wasn't defined by wealth or occupation. It came from within, from a place of passion and dedication. As the night continued, the billionaire found himself increasingly reflective. He had lived his entire life in the world of business and luxury, surrounding himself with other successful, like-minded people. He had always prided himself on his ability to recognize talent and make investments based on that recognition. But the janitor had shown him a lesson that no business meeting or luxury deal ever could. True talent could be hidden in the most unexpected places. The janitor hadn't asked for anyone's attention. He hadn't needed to perform for approval or applause. He had simply played because it was a part of who he was. The billionaire took a deep breath and turned to a group of his closest associates who had gathered nearby. They had watched the entire performance and, like him, had been caught off guard by the janitor's skill. He could see the same look of awe in their eyes. They had come to this event expecting an evening of entertainment and socializing, but instead, they had witnessed something far more profound. "I think we've all learned something tonight," the billionaire said, his voice carrying over the quiet conversations. "The man who played the piano, he has a gift. A real gift, And it's not something we can buy. It's not something that's tied to status or wealth. It's simply talent. The group nodded, some of them still visibly moved by the performance. The billionaire continued, his voice more introspective now. I've spent my life building a fortune, but I've never taken the time to appreciate the simple things, the things that can't be bought. Talent, kindness, humility, they don't come with a price tag. The guests exchanged glances, some of them shifting uneasily. It wasn't that they hadn't recognized these qualities before. It was just that they had been so consumed by the world they inhabited that they had forgotten what it meant to value them. Their conversations had often revolved around deals, investments, and acquisitions. They had spent years associating worth with tangible things, money, property, and power. But the janitor had reminded them that there was another kind of wealth, one that didn't have a price. I want to meet him, the billionaire said suddenly, his tone decisive. He was no longer the arrogant, wealthy man who had made a taunting challenge just hours before. He was now someone who wanted to make amends, someone who wanted to understand the janitor's story, to learn more about the person behind the music. Without waiting for a response, he made his way over to where the janitor was standing near the corner of the room. The janitor, who had slipped back into the background after his performance, had returned to his quiet, unassuming demeanor. He had never sought out recognition. His job was to clean the mansion, not to be the center of attention. But as the billionaire approached, the janitor's eyes met his, and for a brief moment they shared a look of mutual understanding. "You play beautifully," the billionaire said, his voice sincere. "I've never heard anything like it." The janitor, still humble, nodded. "Thank you. I didn't play for recognition. It's just something I do, something that's been a part of me for as long as I can remember." "I get that," the billionaire said thoughtfully. "You didn't need to prove anything to us. But you've taught me something tonight, something I didn't expect. I've been so wrapped up in my own world, so focused on success and money, that I forgot what it really means to appreciate the things that can't be bought. And you, your music, your talent has shown me that." The janitor smiled, his expression kind but reserved. "I never wanted to change anyone's mind. I just wanted to share something real. Music is a way to express what words can't." The billionaire nodded slowly, taking in the janitor's words. He had spent so many years building a fortune, focusing on things that were tangible and measurable, that he had lost sight of the intangible things that truly mattered. Things like passion, authenticity, and connection. "I'm sorry for what I said earlier," the billionaire continued, his tone apologetic. "I didn't mean to mock you. I was wrong, and I want to make it right." The janitor's smile widened slightly, though he wasn't one to make a big deal of things. "There's no need for that. I didn't take offense. I'm here to do my job, and if my music can bring something good into the world, then that's all I need." The billionaire was struck by the janitor's humility. This man, who had just given such a breathtaking performance, had no need for the lavish praise or recognition that others might have sought. He didn't care about the wealth or status that came with the billionaire's world. All he wanted was to share his talent, to offer a piece of himself that could resonate with others. "Would you mind if I asked you to perform again sometime?" the billionaire asked. "Maybe, at one of my gatherings. We could invite others to hear your music." The janitor hesitated for a moment, considering the request. He had never performed for anyone other than himself. His music had always been personal, a way to connect with his own emotions. But something about the billionaire's sincerity made him think twice. "I'll think about it," the janitor said softly. The billionaire smiled, grateful for the opportunity to make amends. "No pressure," he said. "Just know that you're welcome anytime." As the evening drew to a close, the guests began to filter out of the mansion. The music from earlier still hung in the air, lingering in the minds of those who had been present. The billionaire, who had once believed that his wealth was the key to everything, now realized that true value was found in moments like these, moments of connection, of shared humanity. And as for the janitor, he quietly slipped out of the mansion as unassuming as he had arrived. He had done what he came to do. He had shared his gift and, in doing so, had left an indelible mark on the people in that room. But for him, it wasn't about the recognition. It was about the music. And that, in the end, was all that mattered, and this is part 4. If you'd like to continue or need any adjustments, feel free to ask. Here's part 5 of the story. The days following the gathering were filled with curiosity. The mansion, once a place of elite extravagance, now seemed to carry a quiet undercurrent of change. Whispers about the janitor's impromptu piano performance spread among the guests, and the story of his humble talent began to grow beyond the walls of the billionaire's home. People talked, and they shared their impressions of the unassuming man who had transformed a simple social event into something far more profound. The billionaire, however, could not forget the night. The image of the janitor sitting at the grand piano, his fingers moving over the keys with such precision and emotion, haunted him. He couldn't shake the thought that this was a moment of true artistry that had slipped by unnoticed, at least until that night. And yet the janitor had performed without seeking glory, without any expectation of reward. He had simply played. One evening, not long after the party, the billionaire sat alone in his study, staring out the window at the sprawling estate. His thoughts wandered back to the janitor, who had left an indelible mark on him. He couldn't help but wonder about the man's story. Who was he really? Why had he chosen to remain so hidden, working in a place where his talent could go unnoticed by most? The billionaire realized that this was a story he wanted to hear. He wanted to understand the man who had touched his heart with nothing but a piano and a few carefully chosen notes, determined to make things right. And to understand the janitor better, the billionaire reached out. He had an assistant contact the janitor, asking him to come to the mansion again. But this time, it wasn't for a social gathering. It wasn't for an event. The billionaire wanted a simple conversation, a chance to learn more about the man behind the music. The janitor was hesitant at first. He had never been one to seek attention or to be in the spotlight. His life had always been about keeping his head down and doing the work he was paid for. But something in the billionaire's voice, something in the sincerity of the invitation, made him consider it. A few days later, the janitor arrived at the mansion once more. This time, however, he wasn't wearing his usual work clothes. Instead, he wore something a bit more casual, something that still reflected his unpretentious nature. When he stepped into the grand foyer, he was greeted by the billionaire himself, who led him into a quiet, private sitting room. "Thank you for coming," the billionaire said, motioning for the janitor to take a seat. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened that night and about you." The janitor nodded, a little nervous but mostly at ease in the billionaire's company. "I didn't expect anything to come of it. I just played," the billionaire smiled. "And that's why I wanted to talk. I've been thinking a lot about that performance, about how you played not for applause or recognition, but because it was what you felt inside, and that, I think, is what makes it so powerful. Your music wasn't about proving anything. It was about being true to yourself." The janitor looked down, his hands folding in his lap. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, and even now he felt more comfortable listening than speaking. "I was wrong about you," the billionaire continued. "I was so focused on appearances and wealth that I missed what really matters. You showed me that talent doesn't depend on status or what someone does for a living. It comes from within, and that's why I wanted to speak with you." The janitor wasn't sure what to say. It was rare for someone of such wealth and stature to admit that they had been wrong about something, but he appreciated the honesty. "I never meant to change anyone's mind," the janitor said softly. "I just wanted to share something that's always been a part of me. Music helps me express what I can't always put into words. It's the way I connect with the world." The billionaire's expression softened. "You've done that, you know. You've connected with more people than you'll ever realize, and I think you've taught me something I didn't know I needed to learn." The janitor shifted slightly in his chair, feeling the weight of the conversation. He had never been one to seek validation, but in that moment he felt a quiet sense of pride. It wasn't about the recognition. It was about knowing that he had been true to himself. "I just do what I love," the janitor continued. "I never wanted anything more than that. A person can get lost in all the noise, people telling you who you should be, what you should do, what you should have. But in the end, the only thing that really matters is being yourself." The billionaire leaned back in his chair, taking in the janitor's words. He had heard this kind of wisdom from others, but there was something different about hearing it from someone like the janitor. The man's life wasn't filled with riches or titles. He wasn't a celebrated artist or a famous musician, and yet, he seemed to understand something profound about life and what it meant to live it fully. The billionaire began to realize that the janitor's humble lifestyle was in many ways the secret to his own peace of mind. He had been consumed by the chase for wealth, success, and power for so long that he had forgotten the simpler joys of life. The kind of joy the janitor experienced when he played his music, when he could just be himself. "Would you be willing to play again?" the billionaire asked, his voice thoughtful. "I know you don't do it for an audience, but perhaps just one more time for me?" The janitor hesitated. It wasn't about the performance, it was about the invitation. He had never played for someone so important before, especially not someone who had once been so dismissive, but there was something about the sincerity in the billionaire's eyes that made him feel comfortable. "I'll play," the janitor said after a long pause, "but not for the applause, just for the music." The billionaire nodded, grateful for the janitor's willingness to share his gift again. As they walked to the grand piano in the corner of the room, the billionaire noticed something he hadn't before. It wasn't just the music that had touched him that night. It was the quiet confidence of the janitor, the way he carried himself with such humility, despite the beauty of his gift, was something the billionaire had never experienced before. As the janitor sat at the piano and placed his fingers on the keys, the billionaire sat back and listened. The room filled with music once more, music that seemed to speak directly to the soul. The melody was gentle but powerful, each note resonating with an emotional depth that few could ever replicate. It wasn't just about the technical skill. It was the heart behind the music that made it unforgettable. And in that moment, the billionaire realized that the janitor's true talent wasn't just in his music. It was in his ability to remain grounded, to stay true to himself in a world that often tried to change people into something they weren't. It was a lesson that the billionaire would carry with him for the rest of his life. The performance ended, and the janitor rose from the piano, his fingers lingering on the keys for just a moment longer. He turned to the billionaire, who was looking at him with deep respect. "Thank you," the billionaire said, his voice filled with gratitude. "For everything." The janitor simply nodded, his humble smile speaking volumes. "Thank you for listening." And as he quietly left the mansion that day, the billionaire knew that he had just met someone who would forever change the way he saw the world. If you'd like any changes or additions to this part, feel free to let me know.